The days following her conversation with Jessica Holt were filled with a whirlwind of press inquiries, team meetings, and legislative updates. Ava had no time to focus on the fine or the unsettling encounter with Judge Wiggins. Still, her mind occasionally returned to that courtroom moment, wondering if there had been something in the judge's demeanor that she had missed, something that hinted at more than just a random decision. But her life was moving forward, and she couldn't afford to waste time on unanswered questions. By now, her involvement in drafting the federal climate change bill was a matter of public record. Ava was part of a coalition of legal experts, scientists, and environmental activists working to push the bill through Congress. It was a historic piece of legislation, one that could potentially change the way the country addressed climate disasters, emissions, and energy consumption. Every conversation, every negotiation, every strategy session was crucial, and Ava was at the heart of it all. One evening, as Ava sat at her desk in her office, she received an email with the subject line, "Breaking news. Climate change bill gains major support." It was a press release from a national news outlet, highlighting Ava's name among those credited with shaping the bill. The email included quotes from political leaders praising the bill's potential and references to Ava's work in drafting the legal framework. Ava paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She had worked tirelessly on this bill, but this kind of media exposure was unexpected. She had kept a low profile, preferring to stay behind the scenes, but now her name was in the spotlight, attached to one of the most important legislative efforts of the decade. The recognition felt strange, almost disorienting. It was what she had wanted for the bill, but the sudden attention felt like an intrusion. As she scrolled through the article, she was startled to see a familiar name, Judge Harold Wiggins. The article mentioned the recent coverage of his courtroom decisions, with particular attention to the fine he had imposed on a rising environmental advocate. The story went on to describe how the community was grappling with the judge's strict handling of minor offenses, particularly in cases involving people of color. Ava's heart skipped a beat. The mention of her name made her feel exposed in ways she wasn't ready for. The reporter had connected the dots between her and the fine, implying a link between her public work and her treatment in the courtroom. Ava sat back, her thoughts churning. Was this mere coincidence, or was something deeper at play? It didn't take long for her to realize that the judge who had fined her was not just any local figure. He was part of a much bigger story now. His actions, her work, and the intersection of race, law, and climate change were all colliding in ways she had never anticipated. And somehow, it all seemed to be coming full circle. Determined to find out more, Ava reached out to her colleague Marcus, a seasoned journalist who had a knack for digging into the public lives of local officials. She needed answers. Ava Thomas stood in front of the small-town courthouse, her heels clicking against the pavement as she walked toward the entrance. Her tailored navy blue suit, polished shoes, and sharp demeanor stood in stark contrast to the casual atmosphere of the courthouse. It was the kind of place where local residents gathered for minor infractions, not the type of setting someone like Ava usually found herself in. She was an accomplished attorney, known for her legal expertise and as a rising star in environmental law. Ava was used to working in the fast-paced, high-stakes world of federal legislation. Yet today, she was facing a much simpler but unexpectedly frustrating task: a traffic violation. A speeding ticket she had received while driving back from a strategy meeting with colleagues. It was a mistake, nothing more, but it was enough to land her in a courtroom. As she stepped inside the courtroom, her eyes met the judge's, Harold Wiggins. He was an older man, mid-60s perhaps, with graying hair and an expression that suggested he had seen it all. He looked at Ava with a mild disinterest, barely acknowledging her presence as he shuffled through his papers. This wasn't uncommon. Judges had seen hundreds of cases like hers, and to them, these small routine offenses were rarely worth a second thought. "Ava Thomas," the judge called out, his voice thick with authority. Ava stood tall, walking to the front of the courtroom, her confidence unwavering. She had already rehearsed her defense in her mind. Simple, clear, and straightforward. She had been speeding, yes, but it was a momentary lapse of judgment. It was not a pattern. She wasn't one to break rules, but in that moment, the pressure of her demanding career had caused her to lose focus. "Your Honor, I understand the violation," Ava said respectfully, her voice steady but firm. "I accept responsibility for it, and am prepared to pay the fine. I just ask for some leniency given the circumstances." Judge Wiggins looked up, his eyes scanning her for a brief moment. There was a flicker of something in his gaze, something Ava couldn't quite place. He studied her, perhaps for a bit too long, before he responded. "You'll pay the fine," he said curtly, "but I'm imposing the maximum penalty. It's important that we all learn to respect the law." Ava's brows furrowed. The maximum penalty. She had expected a fine, but this seemed excessive, especially considering her spotless driving record. It was as if the judge had already made up his mind, already assumed something about her, without hearing her full explanation. "Your Honor," Ava tried again, her tone calm, but now tinged with confusion. "I'm not trying to avoid responsibility here, but—" "No more discussion," Judge Wiggins interrupted, raising his hand to silence her. "I've made my decision." As the gavel struck, Ava's thoughts swirled. She had expected justice, fairness, but instead, she was left with an unsettling feeling. There was something about the way the judge had dismissed her that didn't sit right. Her instincts told her this wasn't just about a speeding ticket. It was about something deeper, something she couldn't quite put into words. Ava walked out of the courtroom, her steps measured but her mind racing. The fine was more than just a financial penalty. It was an affront to her sense of fairness. She had prepared for the worst but didn't expect it to feel so personal. As she reached her car, the reality of the situation settled in. Why had Judge Wiggins imposed the maximum penalty? He had barely looked at her before making his decision. His dismissive air, his quick judgment, left her questioning whether her appearance, her demeanor, or even the color of her skin had played a role in how she was treated. Still, Ava wasn't one to dwell on the small injustices. She was used to navigating the complexities of life with poise, focusing on the bigger picture. Today's incident was a minor setback, nothing more. She tossed the issue aside as she pulled out of the parking lot, determined to focus on the task ahead, her real work. What most people didn't know about Ava was that she wasn't just any attorney. She had spent years immersed in environmental law, working behind the scenes to draft some of the most progressive climate change legislation the country had ever seen. Her most recent project was a comprehensive bill designed to curb emissions, protect vulnerable communities, and push the country toward renewable energy. The bill was in its final stages, and Ava had been coordinating with senators, activists, and policy experts to ensure it passed with the right amendments. Her work had already caught the attention of national lawmakers, and whispers of her involvement had begun to spread. Ava had remained discreet about her identity, preferring to work in the shadows rather than the spotlight. She believed that true change came from hard work, not fame, and the legislation she was drafting was more important than any personal recognition. Yet, the phone call she received later that afternoon brought her life into sharper focus. "Miss Thomas, is this Ava Thomas, the attorney working on the climate change bill?" The voice on the other end belonged to a reporter, Jessica Holt. Ava sat up straighter in her chair, her curiosity piqued. "Yes, I'm Ava," she replied, keeping her voice measured. She wasn't accustomed to media inquiries, especially not one so direct. "We'd love to do a feature on your role in this important legislation," Jessica continued. "The bill is gaining traction, and we believe your work is at the center of this movement. How do you feel about the progress it's making?" Ava paused. She had kept her work mostly private, aware that the more visible she became, the harder it would be to stay focused on the mission. But she knew this was inevitable. The country needed change, and her name was starting to be attached to that change. "I'm just one part of a much larger effort," Ava replied. "The true credit goes to everyone involved in making this possible." The conversation ended, But Ava couldn't shake the weight of it. Her work was becoming public, and with that recognition, she couldn't ignore the rising tension between her public persona and the private reality she was trying to maintain. Little did she know, her path would soon collide with Judge Wiggins in ways neither of them could anticipate. Judge Harold Wiggins sat in his study, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He had just finished reviewing several legal briefs, and as usual, the cases seemed straightforward, nothing out of the ordinary. But today, his mind kept returning to one face, one name: Ava Thomas, the woman he had fined so harshly in his courtroom just days earlier. At first, he had brushed it off as just another minor case. Traffic violations were routine. He handed out fines every day without thinking much of it. But the moment he had seen her, standing tall, poised, with a level-headed argument, something had stirred within him. There was no denying it. She had a presence, and when he imposed the maximum fine, something inside him had felt too swift, too harsh. It nagged at him, like a lingering echo that wouldn't fade. His thoughts wandered to the press coverage he had stumbled upon earlier that morning. The article mentioned Ava Thomas and her significant role in drafting federal climate change legislation. Her work was now making national waves, and her name was being mentioned in the same breath as some of the country's top environmental advocates. She wasn't just any attorney. She was at the forefront of a major legal movement. And the realization hit him hard. The woman he had so carelessly fined wasn't just someone off the street. She was a legal powerhouse, an advocate for change. And now he felt like a fool. Judge Wiggins leaned back in his chair, the weight of his decision weighing on him. He wasn't one to second-guess his rulings. After all, he had decades of experience on the bench. But this felt different. He couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something about Ava's case had been handled wrong. More so because he hadn't taken the time to truly understand who she was, what she was doing, and the impact her work could have. Instead, he had allowed a bias, one he hadn't even realized he harbored, to cloud his judgment. He had assumed that she was just another person trying to get out of a simple traffic fine. He hadn't thought about her story, her career, or what motivated her. His mind raced as he replayed their brief interaction in court. The fine, her calm composure, and most of all, the sudden realization that he had made a snap judgment based on appearances. Could it have been something more? Had he let his personal biases influence his ruling? The thought of having treated someone with so much potential so unfairly weighed heavily on him. It was unsettling. But what unsettled him even more was the fact that, until now, he had never questioned his own judgment in such cases. Ava was a turning point. Her case wasn't just another file to be shuffled aside. It had triggered something inside him, a need to confront his own shortcomings. He couldn't just let this go. The next morning, Judge Wiggins made a decision he hadn't expected. He would reach out to Ava. He didn't know how she would respond, but he knew one thing for certain. He needed to apologize. It was the only way forward. He had to face his own biases, and perhaps through this small act, he could begin to change, not just for Ava, but for everyone who came before him in the future. Ava sat at her desk, scanning through emails and proposals for the climate bill, when her phone buzzed with another notification. She glanced down to see a headline flash across her screen. Judge who fined environmental advocate faces criticism after her national recognition. Ava's stomach churned. Her name, once again, was in the spotlight, but this time, it wasn't for the groundbreaking work she was doing on climate change. Instead, it was for the fine she had received, a detail that seemed to be overshadowing everything else. She tapped on the link, and the article came into view. It detailed Judge Wiggins' recent rulings, with particular attention paid to the fine he had imposed on Ava. The story painted a picture of a judge whose strict demeanor and seemingly harsh penalties had raised questions in the community, especially after Ava's emerging role in the climate change debate. The narrative implied that his decision was more than just a legal ruling. It was an example of the broader societal issues he was now facing, issues tied to race, authority, and bias in the legal system. Ava took a deep breath. It wasn't surprising that her case had drawn attention, but it wasn't how she wanted to be recognized. She had worked tirelessly for years to build her reputation in environmental law. And now, it felt as though her professional achievements were being reduced to a minor courtroom encounter. And yet, she couldn't shake the sense that there was a deeper story beneath the surface. A story that, if told the right way, could create the kind of societal shift she had always hoped for. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Marcus, the journalist she had reached out to earlier. Marcus, I dug into Wiggins. His past is troubling. He's made controversial rulings before, especially in cases where race plays a role. There's more to the story than just your fine. I'll call you in 10. Ava's heart sank. She had suspected there was more to Judge Wiggins' decision, but to hear it confirmed was a blow. It wasn't just about one bad ruling. It was about a pattern of bias, one that seemed to extend beyond the courtroom and into the very heart of the justice system. She hadn't anticipated this angle. As Ava set the phone down, her mind raced. This wasn't just about a fine anymore. This was about something much bigger, the role the legal system played in shaping the lives of people like her. She had always known the justice system was flawed, but to now see her own case become a symbol for these larger issues made her realize just how much work there was to be done. The climate bill she was drafting suddenly felt even more critical. But before she could continue with her work, there was something else she had to address, something that had become personal. The story of the fine had taken on a life of its own, and in that, there was an opportunity for change. Ava knew she had to act. But how? Should she continue focusing solely on the bill, or was it time to confront the larger, systemic issue at play? Ava stared at her phone, Marcus' message echoing in her mind. She had expected some backlash, but this was more than she had anticipated. Judge Wiggins' past, filled with controversial rulings, was now part of the narrative surrounding her fine. She had always known that the intersections of race, power, and justice were complicated, but seeing it so directly in her own life made her feel exposed, vulnerable even. It was then that Ava made a decision. The weight of her own experience had made it clear, if there was any hope for real change, she couldn't just focus on her legal work. The personal had to meet the political. She had a platform now, and the story about the fine had grown too significant to ignore. If anything, it highlighted the very issues she was working to address through climate legislation: systemic inequality, unfair treatment, and the need for reform. That afternoon, Ava's office received a call from a private number. She answered, expecting another press inquiry, but instead heard the voice of someone she hadn't expected to hear. Ava Thomas. The voice was older, gravelly, with an air of authority that felt almost apologetic. Yes, this is Ava. This is Judge Harold Wiggins. I'm calling because I've been thinking a lot about our encounter in the courtroom, and I'd like to speak with you. In person, if you're willing. Ava's heart skipped a beat. Judge Wiggins. She had assumed her only connection to him would be the courtroom incident, but now, here he was, reaching out to her directly. She had to admit, she hadn't expected this. Of course, she replied, her voice calm, but her mind was racing. I'd be open to meeting. I think it's important that we talk, Wiggins continued. I need to explain myself, and hopefully, offer you an apology. Ava didn't know what to say. She had wondered whether he'd even realized the gravity of what he had done. The fine had seemed so trivial at the time, yet now it was part of a larger conversation, a conversation about bias, privilege, and the legal system's treatment of people of color. And yet, hearing the judge ask for a chance to speak directly to her left Ava conflicted. She wasn't sure what his apology would mean, but part of her was curious to hear it. Let's meet tomorrow, Ava agreed. I think it's time we talk. As she hung up the phone, she took a deep breath. She didn't know what would come from this conversation, but she felt a strange sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something bigger than herself, something that could open the door to real change. It was one thing to fight for justice in the courtroom. It was another to confront it head-on, in an honest conversation. And Ava was ready for it. The next morning, Ava arrived at a quiet cafe, a place tucked away from the public eye. She wasn't sure what to expect from her meeting with Judge Wiggins, but something told her it would be more than just a simple apology. When she stepped inside, the warmth of the sunlight streaming through the windows contrasted with the cool apprehension she felt. She found a corner table, her back straight, her posture telling of the confidence she had built over years of hard work and perseverance. Moments later, she saw him walk in. Judge Wiggins, his familiar gray suit, his purposeful stride. He looked much like he did in court, but today there was a softness in his expression, something different. He walked over to the table and extended his hand. "Ava," he said, his voice calm but sincere. "Thank you for agreeing to meet with me." Ava stood, shaking his hand, but her mind was already evaluating the situation. This was a moment of reckoning for both of them. What did he expect from this conversation? What did she expect? She gestured for him to sit across from her, her gaze steady. "I wasn't sure if you'd even reach out," Ava said, her voice measured but open. "I didn't expect an apology, but I appreciate you wanting to speak with me." Wiggins nodded, a small sigh escaping him as he took a seat. "I've been thinking a lot about that day," he began. "And I'll admit, I didn't handle it the way I should have. I imposed that fine quickly, without really considering who you are, or what you stand for. I let my own biases cloud my judgment. And for that, I'm sorry." Ava listened carefully, but she didn't rush to respond. There was something raw in his words, an honesty she hadn't expected from the man who had ruled so coldly in his courtroom. "I appreciate you acknowledging that," she said slowly. "But it's not just about the fine. It's about the way the legal system handles people like me, people who don't always fit the mold, people whose voices are so often dismissed." Wiggins looked down for a moment, clearly uncomfortable. "You're right," he said quietly. "It's something I've never truly considered before. I've spent my career as a judge, dispensing what I thought was fairness, but I see now that fairness is often subjective, especially when it comes to people who don't look like me." Ava's heart sank a little at the rawness of his admission. It's not just about one fine. It's about the bigger picture, the way the system treats people based on assumptions and prejudices. My work on climate change isn't separate from this. It's all connected. The systemic issues that affect marginalized communities are the same ones that make it harder for people like me to get a fair chance. Judge Wiggins sat in silence for a long moment. Ava could see the wheels turning in his mind, the recognition of his own part in this system of inequity. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than before. "I've spent so much of my career focusing on the law, but I've never questioned the system itself. I've been blind to the way it perpetuates inequality." He paused, then added, "Thank you for making me see it." Ava looked at him, surprised by the weight of his words. This wasn't just an apology, it was a reckoning, a shift in perspective. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't enough on its own, but it was a start. She could see that he was beginning to understand, in his own way, the importance of his role in this larger narrative. "I hope it's the start of something more," Ava replied. "For both of us." The conversation between Ava and Judge Wiggins lingered in the back of her mind as the days passed. In some ways, it felt like a quiet victory, a small but meaningful step toward breaking down the walls of misunderstanding and bias. But Ava knew that the road ahead was still long. Apologies, no matter how sincere, could not erase the deep-rooted issues in the justice system or the broader societal structures that upheld them. Yet, Ava felt a flicker of hope. She believed that change was possible, one conversation at a time, one person at a time. And if anything, this dialogue had opened the door to that possibility. As she returned to her work on the climate change bill, Ava's sense of purpose had only deepened. Her name was now associated with a major piece of legislation, and the pressure was mounting. But she no longer felt the weight of it as she once had. There was a new clarity in her work, She wasn't just drafting policies for the sake of change. She was advocating for a future where justice and equity were at the heart of every decision made, not just in environmental law, but across the board. The climate bill, which had begun as a legal document filled with dense language, had taken on a new meaning for Ava. She had become a symbol of resilience, both in her fight for the planet and in her personal journey. The story of the fine, once a source of frustration, had now become part of a much larger narrative about systemic change. She was no longer just an advocate for the environment. She was an advocate for those whose voices had been silenced, for those who had faced the same kinds of unfair treatment she had. Judge Wiggins, too, had undergone his own transformation. He had taken steps to confront his own biases, seeking out additional training on fairness and equity in the judicial system. He had made it a point to listen more, to understand the people before him, not just as defendants or plaintiffs, but as human beings with their own stories, struggles, and histories. Ava didn't know if their paths would cross again. She had no expectations of the judge. But she did know this. The conversation they had shared had planted a seed. Change was never easy, and it never happened overnight, but it had to start somewhere. And now, there was a small but undeniable shift in the air, a shift toward a more just and equitable future, both in the courts and in the fight for climate justice. As she sat in her office one evening, looking over the final drafts of the climate bill, Ava allowed herself a rare moment of quiet satisfaction. She had been part of something bigger than herself, something that would affect generations to come. And though the journey was far from over, she felt more prepared than ever to face the challenges ahead. She had found her voice, and it was stronger than ever.